Welcome to ONS Energy Talks. My name is Ingvild Meland and I'm the Program Director of ONS Foundation. The topic of today is the growth in renewables, and we also use the opportunity to dig into the offshore wind developments, and in the end we will touch on the corona situation and the effects on the energy transition. I cannot do this alone, and I have with me one of the most knowledgeable persons that I know in renewables. He is the editor-in-chief of the Recharge, and Recharge is a global magazine on renewable energy and low-carbon solutions. Mr. Darius Snieckus, welcome.
Thank you.
We are very glad to see you, and these days we must start by asking, how are you, and how is your corona situation?
Yes, well, that's very kind of you to ask. I think we're all making our adjustments, the new normal, such as it's being described. Certainly, it comes with its challenges, but I think as a journalist of 30 years standing, I've always been someone who sort of plays it where as he sees it. And that is to say, wherever we have a laptop and a Wi-Fi connection, we can function now. So the Recharge team is dotted around the world, and we spend our days, as we really have for many years, in digital connection. Certainly, there are competing demands now that we're all working from home, domestic and professional, and we try to make allowance for those, so far as we can. But I think that in majority, and you see this with obviously a lot of the companies that we deal with in interviews and meetings, that humankind is nothing if not adaptable, and we will overcome this, and we will come through the worst of the first wave of the coronavirus. I hope with a clear idea of how we are to live moving forward.
I'm glad to hear that. And before we jump into kind of understanding renewable markets, I want to ask you, because you have 25 years of experience of covering energy from oil and gas into the renewables, but now you're in charge of Recharge. And how do you work on your everyday life to make sure you're on top on the renewable develops in industry, on the players, on who's the front runners, and what are the most important technology to watch out for, and also kind of what are the frame conditions that is important to develop this sector? How do you see this?
Well, I think we've been very fortunate in having grown up, as a title, very much shoulder to shoulder with the renewables industry. That is to say, if you go back to the early days at Recharge in 2009, when we launched, renewables globally was still seen very much as a marginal industry. And certainly, obviously, over the last 11 years that Recharge has been in existence, that's changed radically. So I think that we've been able to grow with the industry. Obviously, our contact base, if you like, has become very highly developed over those years. The regard that Recharge is paid, for the caliber of coverage we provide, for the sort of intelligence we'd like to think we bring to the debate around the energy transition, means, I think, in large that we're very fortunate to have the industry sort of come to us, if you like, to keep us abreast of the latest developments. Now, obviously, we have strong connections with analyst groups around the world, and that's imperative to our coverage. It allows us, obviously, to attach figures to our stories, and everyone knows that the best intelligence has both I think words and numbers, if you like.
So you were sorry. So you were early believers in the energy transition and kind of the growth in renewable energy. So. And you've been following this development very, very closely. How will you describe what has happened over the last, 10, 12 years in this sector? And are we where you thought we would be, or are we come even further than what you could expect?
Yes, I think the question is being asked at really in a time where the industry is in the crucible. What we've seen in the last 10, 11 years. Certainly has been a transformation, that we call it the energy transition, but it's obviously it's much bigger than that. The planet has been powered by hydrocarbons for the last 200 years, and now is making a very rapid, and hopefully even more rapid still, transition to being powered by renewables. If you look back 10, 11 years ago, think of the global financial markets were in the grips of a collapse that had been unseen since the Great Depression. Now, obviously, that comparative point is changing entirely now again with the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy. But Barack Obama was getting his feet under his desk at the White House. Bitcoins are being mined. I mean, you get a sense of sort of how far things have come in the last 11 years in the broadest sense in terms of the global energy system. Well, I think it's interesting we're talking about offshore wind today, in truth, because I think offshore wind and floating wind are very good exemplars of just how radical a transformation is underway on the planet. I remember we had an interview in the early days with what was then Statoil, of course, the Norwegian part state-owned energy company, and now Equinor. And this fellow Rune Rundvik was trying to build the first offshore wind farm off the UK, Equinor's that is. And he said he'd come to the UK expecting the doors to be swung open to him and to Equinor to build this, and it really wasn't the case. There was a great deal of resistance to the idea. There wasn't a belief in offshore wind or renewables more broadly as being competitive in cost terms with fossil fuels. Now, obviously, that's been that belief has been put to rest over the intervening years. And if you consider that in the last 9 years, bar one, renewables has outpaced fossil fuels in terms of new plant construction. That is to say, capacity added to the grid. I think the case is pretty plain that the economics of renewables now are eclipsing those of fossil fuels.
Because you've also previously commented that offshore wind power is on its way to become its own industry. Could you elaborate on that? I mean, costs are down and technologies are up, and the frameworks conditions have been improving over the last years. How do you see this now?
Well, I think offshore wind is a very interesting case, largely, on many levels. To begin with, it brings together three industries in one, and I think that's one of its great great engines for development. That is to say, yes, it's based around wind power, so the turbines have evolved from those that we developed first on land, but the actual construction at sea is very much a maritime industry assignment, if you like. So the jackup vessels that are used to build the wind farms, the cable lay vessels, the service and supply vessels, all this obviously is an industry that goes back hundreds of years. And then the overlay, which is very important, and we'll probably discuss, we'll dig into deeper, is that of the offshore oil and gas industry, the oil and gas industry in the broader sense. Obviously, offshore oil and gas has been an operational industry now for 50 years more. Obviously, some of the earliest offshore oil and gas farms off Europe date back to the late 60s, early 70s. So when you combine these three industries together, I think you begin to get a sense of the kind of scale and scope and potential of the industry. Now, what's most important to say, of course, is again, it's a cost argument, and offshore wind has succeeded in bringing down the levelized cost of energy, as we call it. That is to say, the cost of energy over the life of a project down to from over 200 euros a megawatt hour only 5 years ago to under 50. And we are now in the process of building wind farms that will come online in 2022, 2023, that could have costs even lower still. So at levels of 40, 30, 40, 50 euros a megawatt hour, again, it's far cheaper than coal. It's cheaper than new build gas. It's competitive in a way that that means it very much is joining the mainstream in the global energy system in terms of capacity, in terms of production.
So you're saying that offshore wind has kind of become one of the dominant sources of new power when it comes to due to its increased competitiveness. As all other industries, the wind industry also has its players, the crew of the wind industry. Could you comment on who do you see as the front runners when it comes to at least floating wind and offshore wind in general, and also in addition to that, comment on the traditional E&P players and how they are actually helping to get this offshore wind development.
Well, this is very much to the point. As I said, the scale of offshore wind is something that oil and gas companies, but before them utilities, could really sort of be comfortable with, if you like, in industrial terms. That is to say, if you're speaking to about a utility like Vattenfall, a Swedish utility, or Ørsted, the Danish utility, they look at projects in the $1 billion range. They understand what is involved in terms of project execution that could involve a 2-year build timeline, for instance. So when you think about the way utilities have moved into this space in the last 10 years, and I mentioned Vattenfall and Ørsted, but Iberdrola, the Spanish utility, as well, RWE, is another one. I mean, the European utilities have really taken on offshore wind as a means to transition their companies from fossil fuel generation to renewables generation. And let's be clear, I probably should have said from the outset, if you look at calculations now or forecasts for the size of offshore wind's potential, the International Energy Agency put out its first standalone report on offshore wind last year, and they're forecasting 350 gigawatts by 2040. The International Renewable Energy Agency is saying 1 terawatt by 2050. So this, we're moving into, again, by that point, you're talking about a $1 trillion industry. So this, this is far from being marginal. This is very much an industry of scale and of substance that is going to be fundamental to the energy transition. Big oil has not been, as much a part of the narrative yet, but that's changing rapidly now. Shell obviously has made first investments in offshore wind, both off Europe and the US. BP is making noises about getting heavily into offshore wind. Total, the French oil and gas company, just made its first investment in a floating wind project. Now, this is its first investment in offshore wind in general, but in floating wind in particular. And so that's quite fascinating to see, because it obviously it's undergone its own energy transition, but has been quite focused on solar and energy storage. But now it's seeing the time is right to make the leap into offshore wind. So if you look at some of the analyst forecasts for what offshore wind will make up in the coming years, you have Wood Mackenzie saying 25% of all the world's installed wind power by 2028 will be offshore. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, or BNEF as they call themselves now, sees offshore wind as being much better suited to weathering the coronavirus-fueled economic chaos we're currently facing, and sees in 2026 gigawatts of new offshore wind alone. So put that in the context of a $20 barrel of oil, as we're seeing globally in the crude markets, and the economics of offshore wind only becomes stronger.
So there's a lot of optimistic views on the offshore wind developments, as you mentioned. Do you see any hurdles or elements that will actually hinder the development?
Well, it's a very good question. Finally, I think when you consider, we talk about the oil majors being fundamental to the next phase in development of the offshore wind industry. I mean, consider that by the IEA's estimates, oil and gas currently invests less than 1% of its total capital spend on renewables, and so and only a part of that on offshore wind. So the hurdles really, I think, fundamentally are to getting big oil, its gears meshed and moving, because fundamentally this is like all industry development. This is a question of money, time, and energy, and we clearly do not have much time. I think the energy is certainly there for the transition, but money has to be stumped up. So it was very encouraging to hear last week. We had an interview with Jonathan Cole, who's the head of offshore wind at Iberdrola, the Spanish utility I mentioned. They have a 10 gigawatt pipeline of conventional offshore wind projects coming on in the coming years. They're now expecting to see a further 2 gigawatts of floating wind. So by 2030, so that's huge, because that's as he said himself, they're talking gigawatts and billions of dollars, not megawatts and millions of dollars.
Interesting. Okay, let's move on. So let's take the opportunity to travel the offshore wind world for a couple of minutes now, and let's start in Europe. We've had a new EU presidency, which has been quite ambitious when it comes to cutting carbon emissions. We have the Green Deal projects, and we've also been very ambitious when it comes to offshore wind targets. If my numbers are right, I think they have 450 gigawatts targets within 2050. Could you elaborate? Could you elaborate a little bit on this? And is it realistic? And are we on the right track?
Well, this comes back in some ways to a point I made earlier about the overlapping of three industries here. And what we see, obviously, in offshore wind is not just a question of power production. And the 450 gigawatts that figure that you mentioned is one that was calculated by Wind Europe, which is the wind industry's advocacy body in Europe last year. Now, obviously, 450 gigawatts from a current level of Europe of 19, 20 gigawatts is a huge ask. However, what is felt is that the combined forces of not just the power production potential in greening our power system in Europe, but also the economic development potential. So developing supply chains off in European countries to service this industry, to build the plant, but to service it, to lay the cables, as I said, to connect all this up to the onshore grid. The onshore side of the economic development potential in ports and harbors and further into the network system is enormous. So it's been calculated feasible. Obviously, getting there is going to require something of someone once described it as a war effort to actually construct that much wind plant in the time required. But fundamentally, when you look at the northern seas, when you look at Europe and the round. This is the spiritual home of offshore wind. We have come a very long way in a very short span of time in industrial terms. It really is. It's only to be played for, reaching that sort of level of capacity installation. I will just say, as a kind of sidebar to this, one big part of this puzzle is going to be green hydrogen. One of the limitations on offshore wind is that we can produce huge volumes, but landing it, that is to say, getting it flowing into the grid can be problematic because of pinch points. Too much power to come onto the grid at any one time. Now, if we can begin to incorporate, as Ørsted and Shell and others are doing now in their planning, projects that are not just offshore wind projects, but offshore wind to hydrogen projects, then the power can be stored and used more widely than just in power production. It can be used for shipping. It can be used for aquaculture. It can be used for coastal industry. So again, you can see the kind of concentric circles that offshore wind could build out into in the coming years.
I believe you had an article on that in your latest edition of Recharge, saying, "Is it a marriage made in heaven?" ? And as far as I can hear you now, the answer is yes. But when will we see kind of commercial developments on this project, these kind of projects?
That's right. Well, 2020 has been something already looking like a watershed year for offshore wind and hydrogen as a coupled system. One of the largest wind farms in construction off the UK, it's called Hornsea 2, 1.4 gigawatts. It's been earmarked for a hydrogen production project called Gigastack. So Ørsted, the Danish utility, is involved there, and a company called ITM Power. Shell also unveiled a project called North H2, which is it's a scale bigger. It's a 10 gigawatt project, and they're looking to bring that onshore off the Netherlands. So you begin to get a sense of just how quickly things could move. Netherlands and Denmark are taking the lead along with the UK on this. There have been discussions of what are called energy islands, which would be artificial islands built offshore that would serve as a kind of landing point for hydrogen storage, for electricity substations, as a hitching post to send power onto shore. They would also be supply bases, and they could obviously have hotel setups to house personnel who are working on these islands. So again, it's there's a very strong argument around the fact that first of all, electrolyzers, which are the key part of any hydrogen production technology, they need a very low levelized cost of energy, and offshore wind has this high capacity factor. Sort of, that is to say, it produces large volumes of power a lot of the time. And that's exactly what hydrogen electrolyzers need. Then there is, again, this crossover with the oil and gas industry. Oil and gas understands hydrogen. It's dealt in so-called gray hydrogen, which is produced by oil, or blue hydrogen produced from gas. So it knows the technology, it knows the economics of hydrogen. So you take those those considerations plus this wider kind of blue economy discussion that's emerging around, as I say, powering the shipping industry, powering deep sea fisheries, powering coastal communities, and offshore wind to hydrogen, as we say, and we could have probably dropped the question mark. It is very much a very good industrial fit, those two elements.
It would be really interesting to follow kind of development of hydrogen as energy carrier going forward, kind of also in a broader sense, not only the green hydrogen, but that's a different edition. We'll talk about that some other times. Let's travel over the Atlantic to the US. I mean, I've heard that the offshore wind market in the US could reach almost $70 billion, and that there's a capacity that will nearly double the US current electricity use if you're able to take out this potential.
Yes.
What do you see? How do you see the US and what is happening there? And are there still a political willingness to keep investing in offshore wind?
I mean, at the risk of a rather too obvious pun, the economics of offshore wind in the US is being trumped by political ideology. So the situation you have there is obviously a very strong economic case for the reasons we've already discussed. The potential, as you say, is very much there. Analysts see the US Atlantic Ocean play, so that's just off the East Coast, growing to between 20 and 30 gigawatts by 2030. Floating projects and development off the West Coast. There's talk of the fact that if you build 9 gigawatts of floating wind off California, you could save taxpayers $2 billion on their electricity rates. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is the sort of the landlord of the landlord of the seabed, if that makes sense, in federal waters off the U.S., they have a white paper in the works for looking at floating wind off the East Coast. If you take offshore wind in the round, it's a 2 terawatt resource. So as you say, this would be equal to twice the U.S.'s current electricity use. Fundamentally, the problem is, as so often in many discussions around energy in the U.S., is Trump. A couple of years ago, the then Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke praised America's the offshore wind resource as being God-given, which obviously the kind of the religio-political resonance of that is very strong indeed. But here you have a case where it still is only 30 megawatts of installed capacity, one very small 5 turbine wind farm off Rhode Island. Now, right now, all eyes are on a project called Vineyard Wind off Massachusetts. It's an 800 megawatt project. It's the first utility scale project off the U.S. East Coast, and it was moving forward very quickly until last year. There was an unexpected note through from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which said, "Look, we need to do an extra environmental review of the project." Now that set alarm bells ringing for a lot of the industry. The ship has been steadied to some extent. It's now seen as what can be done on this project to give greater assurance to fisheries, to environmental protection agencies, and the rest would necessarily be good for the wider industry's development going forward. And I think ultimately it's felt, again, speak to any analyst, they'll say, well, look, the size of the resource, the importance, again, in terms of economic development, to ports and harbors and cities along the East Coast mean that there is a kind of unstoppable motion to this sector's development. But as I say, mixed messages are problematic for any industry. What the industry wants is clarity and very clear optics for its development. What I will say, which I think is a very interesting point in discussion, is again the investment levels we're talking about here. One analyst, Ristad, a Norwegian analyst, in fact, made the calculation that by the mid 2020s we're going to see investment in U.S. offshore wind, the industry there, eclipsing that going into the country's offshore oil and gas sector. Now, it's quite an extraordinary tipping point to have reached. They're now expecting $15 billion going into offshore wind by the mid 2020s.
It's interesting to hear that you're optimistic about the US, but still there's a political uncertainty, and also you need to, of course, you need to take care of the environmental regulations and making sure you do all the necessary preparations for your projects. But I mean that's not unique for the US. We need to do this all over the world, and just let's travel to Asia, because that's where kind of two of the biggest markets for energy, India, China. And I also know that floating wind and offshore wind in general has a huge potential over there. Could you say something about how you consider China and India in that way?
Yes. Well, okay, I mean, Asia is, as you rightly say, it's sort of the wildest of the wild cards currently. China is on record as saying it wants to build 41 gigawatts of offshore wind by the end of next year. Now, clearly, that logistically cannot happen. That doesn't mean that it's it's not a question of trajectories, and this kind of gigawattage will be built eventually. But when you consider that only 2.3 gigawatts was installed in 2019, of 41 gigawatts as an installed capacity overall is definitely I think a little wishful. And again, analysts all broadly see that. There are supply chain bottlenecks, particularly on the construction vessel side, and then of course, COVID-19 has shut down a lot of the industry, and it's only just beginning to restart now. So obviously, one of the beauties of offshore wind is that it can be built not far offshore for coastal cities, and China has a very large number of coastal megacities. So offshore wind will be important to the powering of those cities and the provinces that they are capitals to. There's a very interesting signal in recent weeks from the China Longwan Power Group, which is the world's biggest turbine operator. And they have tied up with a small French company called Dauphine. With I beg your pardon, they've tied up what. It's not, I beg your pardon, I misspoke there. Dauphine is actually involved with CIMC Raffles, and I'll come on to that in just a second. But China Longwan Power Group is moving into floating wind. So what that means, again, is a kind of industrial might that it will bring to the sector's development, particularly in the domestic waters, is going to be enormous, and will certainly, again, the market signal there is that floating wind is economically viable and will be part of the energy mix for Asian countries going forward. I mentioned Dauphine, the French floating wind technology developer. They actually signed a memorandum of understanding with CIMC Raffles, which for those who are in the offshore oil and gas industry know is one of the largest construction yards on the planet. What that agreement said effectively is they're going to collaborate on projects in Asia, but also Europe. So CIMC Raffles as a construction yard diversifying sees not just the domestic market potential, but also an international one. So stepping back sort of one remove, we need to consider that the size of the build out of China will be world leading. The government's NDRC Energy Research Institute forecast at the end of 2019 that the installed offshore wind capacity off China would climb to around 8 gigawatts by the end of 2021, 12 gigawatts a year later, and then absolutely explode around 2025 to 26, 27 gigawatts. Now, again, COVID-19 has colored a lot of forecasts, but Asia, out with China, that is to say Asia excluding China, is still expected currently by most analysts to see installation of around 18 to 20 gigawatts of offshore wind over the course of the next decade, and that would be 35% of total new capacity, plant capacity installed in the region. So as we've been saying all along, it's the scale and scalability of offshore wind that makes it so very attractive to investment and to the energy transition discussion. There was a recent study, and I'll just sort of wind down on this, but Harvard University and Huazhong University in China, they calculated offshore wind could meet 36% of all coastal energy demand in China. So again, it's the sheer size of potential here to build plant capacity that you could only previously think about, oil and gas or coal or maybe nuclear representing. But offshore wind can measure up in this respect.
So, if I understand you correct, you say that the Chinese ambitions are huge, but maybe not realistic on the short term. We recently spoke also to Narendra Taneja, which is in this ONS Energy Talk series. He's an expert on energy from India, and he's saying that energy needs all the energy it can get, and also offshore wind and also floating wind. But are you seeing them being less mature than the Chinese are when it comes to developing offshore wind?
Yeah, I mean, India has always been a fascinating case study in ambition and reality. Obviously, the targets that India set for their renewable energy build out in recent years, were certainly competitive with China's. What we've seen, obviously, is that targets haven't been met in terms of onshore wind and solar build out. And obviously, the COVID-19 impact is going to be felt very deeply in that country. Yes, there have been early discussions around building offshore wind off India. Again, all the right names were attached to these early discussions of a first auction. You had Ørsted and Equinor and Iberdrola and others all expressing interest. But fundamentally, one of the central challenges India faces is that there's just so much land upon which onshore wind could be built, and obviously onshore wind continues to be less expensive than offshore. So I think that broadly the consensus is that certainly India will see offshore wind become a big part of its energy mix in years to come, but perhaps not at the rate of development that we might see in other countries. But it was a very interesting piece of work that's being done by the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation. We could talk a bit more about, which was looking at emerging offshore wind markets. They put out a first report last year, which identified a number of six countries which it felt could make the leap very quickly into offshore wind. This report talked about emerging markets, and this ranged from Brazil to South Africa to India to Vietnam to a lot of island nations, could represent 3 terawatts of energy. So again, it's a huge amount of power production potential, and again the economic development potential that goes along with it. Building domestic industrial supply chains that could construct this offshore wind, could service this offshore wind. We're very much part of that report too. But India, again, there's no question of potential there. Wind speeds and open acreage at sea, the growing demand of the fastest growing economies on the planet, all speak to the fact that offshore wind will become fundamental to India in the future, but probably a little more slowly than we had hoped for in a couple of years ago.
So let's jump from ambitions and targets and back home to Norway to kind of concrete projects and approvals. Back in Norway, we know we have a great wind potential, offshore wind potential. We know we have a lot of competence on offshore developments. And recently, we also got approved from the ministry about the Hywind Tampen project. And there are hopes that a new area, new acreage will be awarded to do offshore wind projects. How are you seeing Norway in this, and especially developments in floating wind?
Yeah, it's been one of the most interesting sort of running narratives in the renewable space. I feel I was technology editor for the first 6 years of Recharge's existence before I took on the editor-in-chief role. And in fact, my first press trip back in 2009 was off to see the Hywind demo, the world's first floating wind turbine. And as you rightly say, the opportunity represented by offshore wind and floating wind for Norway is manifold. The emissions reduction argument, you look at aging oil and gas fields such as Snorre Gullfaks, where Hywind Tampen, which is an 88 megawatt floating array, is going to be built. You can take up 35% of the energy demand on those platforms. You can reduce emissions. I think it was equal to 1.4 million cars coming off the road. So there's certainly the potential there. The wider discussion around using floating and offshore wind to power aging oil and gas fields is slightly problematic insofar as many see it as a dirtification of wind, while obviously the emissions reduction and power supply arguments are sound. Offshore wind also represents a potentially, major source of green power to complement Norway's hydropower infrastructure. So, there have been numerous studies from major players like ABB and others, and Konkraft, the industry body in Norway, has put out a recent report which looked at this too. If you built out in a stepwise fashion, offshore wind in a stepwise fashion, sort of gigawatt by gigawatt off Norway, you could begin to think about offshore wind being a kind of slipstream of power into the Norwegian hydropower infrastructure, which of course, ironically is one of the things that sort of kept offshore wind from developing as quickly as it might in Norway, because you have this vast hydropower resource. But we don't hear so much of this these days, but there was a very serious talk around looking at Norway as having all its hydropower dammed hydropower resources as being the battery for Europe, because you could effectively use offshore wind to pump hydro up through different levels of these hydropower stations. And then once that was done, this becomes stored energy. And this could be used to balance grids through Europe and support the interconnector infrastructure between different countries in Europe. And so that was, that remains a real potential, certainly. And then, the other, as we've said many times in this discussion already, the economic development potential. You have a country in Norway that obviously has a very well developed offshore oil and gas and maritime industries, and that goes from the R&D level straight up to project execution through to operations and maintenance. So this wider blue economy discussion is one that Norway is in a position to lead from the front on. And then finally, in some ways, most of all, the Norwegian government is targeting being carbon neutral by the end of this decade. So it has to move forward with a strategy that will shift its overall energy mix away from hydrocarbons and to electrons, and offshore wind and floating wind really best represent the potential there. So it's Equinor has to be mentioned in this discussion at this point, because they have been very much in the advanced guard when it comes to the energy transition in the oil industry. Equinor, I mentioned earlier, has bottom fixed projects off the UK. It has a floating wind, the world's first floating wind array, Hywind Scotland, off Scotland. It has projects in the US and a pipeline in Asia as well. And it is co-developing the largest offshore wind farm on the planet, Dogger Bank, 3.6 gigawatts, enough power to keep the lights on in 5 to 7% of UK homes. I mean, the scale of what Equinor is attempting in its transition is hugely impressive. And also, if you go down the supply chain in Norway, you have Aker Solutions, for instance, that's investing in floating wind. You have Kvaerner investing in floating wind, and Able. Likewise, there are industrial clusters in Norway that are going to do see the enormous diversification potential in shifting across. But as we say, there are still hurdles. I think there are 3 blocks of acreage off Norway that have been sitting there fallow, waiting for the earmark for floating and offshore wind, but they've not yet been developed. Those need to move forward. And Hywind Tampen, as you rightly say, is a very important project, because it will be a case study for using floating wind for oil and gas, for offshore oil and gas developments going forward as well.
I think we both can agree that Norway is an energy nation today, and we will be an energy nation tomorrow. But then the question is, which type of energy nation will we be? We promised our listeners to touch on the coronavirus and the effects on the energy transition. And the main title of your recharge recently was why the global coronavirus pandemic could supercharge energy transition and power our green economic recovery. For us who hasn't read the whole magazine, could you give us the answer?
Well, yes, the boil down. Well, I mean, I think if there's one certainty we can agree on in our coronavirus altered reality, that is that no prediction at this point is probably worth the paper it's written on. However, the shift in the global energy system from fossil fuels to renewables is, as I say, is it's undeniable, it's incontrovertible. The speed of the transition is certainly not fast enough. That's recognized. But if you consider that, that powering the planet on coal, oil, and gas, as we've done since the Industrial Revolution, is now coming to an end, and wind, solar, wave, tidal, new hydropower, green hydrogen, biofuels, new battery chemistries. I mean, there are clean energy technologies that are as yet undreamt of. This is all part of our collective future. So the coronavirus, as many have commented, is sort of the great pause on the planet. It's giving us a chance to take a breath as far as we can. And I mean, that's a poor choice of words, given the nature of the coronavirus and the way it attacks the lungs. But the point is, on a very high industrial and governmental and policy level, there is a lot of money that's been supporting the fossil fuel industry through the years. Fossil fuel, the subsidies, obviously, new investment that supports an exploration and production industry globally, and with oil now at, as I say, $20 a barrel thereabouts. All of a sudden, renewables and offshore wind, very much at the heart of this, has an internal rate of return that shareholders can sort of accept, if you like. Where oil and gas always produces around a 20% rate IRR, internal rate of return, renewables is more like 5 to 10%. And now with oil, with the crude markets having collapsed, offshore wind is competitive, for instance, with oil and gas. So even if the crude price were to rebound, it would be a dead cat bounce. There is this tightening vice, shareholders, government, public pressure. The petro giants have to commit to moving more rapidly to zero carbon operations. It's a question of corporate survival. They will not be here in 10 years unless they make this shift. There is plenty of investment headroom, as I mentioned earlier. Big oil is not investing in renewables, or has not historically invested in renewables in any meaningful way. So the potential is there. At the same time, as I mentioned, 75% of all new plant turned on last year around the world, power production plant is renewables based. So in the near term, I think it's broadly agreed that every industry is going to take a very substantial hit here. There's no way that the coronavirus, the impact of the coronavirus, will not be felt by renewables. We've seen turbine plants closed and now reopened. We've seen major disruption to supply chain, to logistics, to personnel. If you're going to work on an offshore wind farm, there are certain companies now that are setting up coronavirus ships so that you can go through a quarantine period before or after as you come back on shore. But look, I mean, fundamentally, what we're talking about here is so much bigger than just the energy industry, if I can put it that way. I mean, talk around the fact that this could be the end of neoliberalism as we've known it. The articles of faith being, free market, self-regulation, sustained economic growth as the engine of human progress, austerity-guided government. This has all been shaken to its foundations. None of this, we can't return to these practices in the way that we left them before they were operating before COVID-19. So look, there are trillions of dollars that are going to go into fending off the worst of the worldwide economic collapse we're seeing, and that stimulus money, if directed properly, to use the term, would be a means to seeing the world come out of this coronavirus with a much more clearly defined energy transition track to travel. IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, price tagged a complete global transformation of the energy system at $10 trillion. Now we have $10 trillion. We have much more as a planet, to bring to bear on this. I'll quote IRENA's Director General, Francesco La Camera, who said last week that renewables are more economic than fossil fuel on 4/5 of the planet already. This is a fact. If you want to accelerate toward a market that will inevitably be there, you have to build the environment for it. Now is not a question of price; it's a question of demand, and now is the right moment. So, I don't think you can say it any more plainly than that. I think that there is reason to be optimistic, but there has to be a shared agenda among global governments to make this happen.
Darius, I read you as extremely optimistic on behalf of the renewable energy industry, and I'm very glad to hear that. And I also read you as hearing that there are political uncertainty around the world in different forms, and that the time schedule will sometimes be altered due to political decisions. But the competitiveness of the renewable sources have improved so much that you're really now competing and actually to some extent coming out better than fossil fuels when it comes to new projects. And the main message that you have is that the energy transition is on and that the coronavirus will not stop this revolution. Do you think that's a good conclusion? Then we.
I couldn't. Yes, I could. Of course, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think what I did come out of oil and gas. I was a reporter for 13 years in that industry, and certainly what I've seen in the last 11 years, very much supports the view that this is an unstoppable transition. It needs to accelerate greatly if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of the climate emergency once the first wave of COVID-19 makes its way through. But I think hope does spring eternal, and while there is life, there is hope.
Let that be the last word of this conversation. Thank you, Darius, for joining us, and thank you for all the listeners to the ONS Energy Talk. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Ingvild.